they use cycle as a substitute for genre. In addition, the use of the word vampire, in addition, the use of the word vampire to refer to the Pontianak has been questioned and contested over time. Malaysian academic Andrew Ng, who has written extensively on the Pontianak, claims that she, quote, that she has been translated as vampire is initially due to the fact that the English language has not a word that could correctly describe it. The word that best describes the Pontianak would be the undead. So not vampire or a banshee, you know. Yeah. In this respect, the exploration of a particular genre's definition and interpretation should not only rely upon the traditional, intrinsic approach to textual analysis, but also enable us to look at the ways in which these definitions and interpretations are part of the larger cultural operations of genre. For example, in this case, the subgenre or genre of the Pontianak films can be situated within critical receptions and or popular discourses. In other instances, the Pontianak films are referred to by other labels such as chiller and thriller, as is the case of this English language newspaper advertisement. The famous Malayan chiller. This one, Pontianak meets her match in the maddest scream thriller of the year. This one is the term super thriller, in another super thriller. Yeah. As well as other, in Malay, they use the term seram. Seram means horror. Yeah, I'm not sure about this. Yeah? They use vampire. Oh, blood-sucking. Monster. Okay, blood-sucking monster, yeah. So it is advertised also in Chinese media because the Pontianak films were also dubbed in Mandarin and managed to attract audiences among the Chinese viewers here, among the Chinese, ethnic Chinese. Alright, this is my concluding remarks. Throughout this lecture, I've attempted to trace the history of Malaysian cinema by accentuating and examining genres in cultural practice. This being the case, genre are cultural processes best looked at in specific historical instances, particularly the ways in which genres are operative and constituted in everyday life. I began by identifying oral and written forms of folk literature, the structures, forms, and genres from which many Malay films borrowed and adapted, and then traced proto-cinematic forms that shaped old Malay cinema back to the indigenous prototype genre of Malay cinema, the purba films, or periods films set in ancient times. By doing so, I have argued that with musical sequences injected into the form as well as elements of magic and superstition, the genres of Malay cinema transcend the realist, non-realist generic dichotomy, which is much assumed in Anglo-American film scholarship. Then I also trace the global cinematic forms and practices that help shape and influence the content of genre of old Malay films, identifying the influence of melodrama as primary mode and shape many Malay films regardless of genres, all the way to the global filmmaking practices demonstrated by imported Indian and Filipino directors. Finally, I've shown that genres drew on global popular labels and categories not only in terms of aesthetics and forms, but also in terms of wider cultural practices, for example, film marketing, exhibition, and reception. By charting the history of Malaysian cinema through genre, I hope to have indicated that as products of specific histories and social cultural formations, Malay film genres of this period embodied and expressed society's collective values, psyches, and anxieties. In addition, they reflected cultural hybridity and promiscuity, which helped render the early phase of Malaysian cinema so diverse, rich, and cosmopolitan, as both genre and culture are identical and boundary phenomena. Most importantly, I hope to have demonstrated that genre can be approached and understood as discursive formations and practices, while at the same time enabling us to regard it as both fluid and static, active processes and stable products. That's all. Thank you very much. Terima kasih. So now let me hand over to Zoe.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Norman, for such a found presentation very fascinating. And I really enjoy watching all the film clips, the Malay films in the 1950s and 1960s. And I'm supposed to be a discussant in the session today, but I will try my best to have my feedback on Norman's presentation just now. But before that, I'll just add side notes on some names or the films that appears in the presentation just now that we might see very interesting relations with all those things. So we watched a clip of Raja Museum that is called The Fang King. So basically it's a story of a king who of a cruel king who from the kingdom of Kedah who accidentally drank a bowl of soup made by her very strange mic made by her maid, and the soup was actually their blood drips into the soup, and then since then he enjoyed drinking the soup, and he found that the soup are very tasty, but he didn't really realize that there are actually blood in the soup. So later on, then that's why he got his fang tips. But very interestingly, actually, Raja Museum, the scriptwriter of Raja Museum, is actually Tunku Abdul Rahman, which is the independent father of Malaysia and the first Prime Minister of Malaysia. And the Fang, in the original story of the Fang King, because he was a very cruel king, and he appears getting more cruel, and so later his fang, his teeth was then ripped off and threw to a place called Baling, which there is a Baling peace talk during the Malayan emergency, whereas there is a peace talk between the British and some political figures in Malaya, and also with the Malayan communists during that time. So what I'm trying to say is there's a very interesting interconnection, although we are looking at the films in the 1950s and 1960s. They are fascinating, they are very entertaining and fascinating to watch, but there is also a very interesting undercurrent that was happening during that time. And before I start the presentation today, I would like to show you a clip. It's actually a musical made it's a production of the Shaw Brothers in Hong Kong. It's called The Love Parade. It's a musical made in the year 1963, featuring a very famous star called Lin Dai. So at the end of the musical, there's like this is supposed to be a fashion show. So it's the grand finale of the musical is a fashion show because the protagonist is one of the protagonists is a fashion designer, and in the fashion show you can see many different cultures coming together in this fashion show, and you'll see like a Japanese in here, and also someone that audience here might be familiar with. I'll just watch it. This is the protagonist, she's a very famous star in the Shaw Brothers during the 60s and end of 50s to 60s. And we still have 1 more minute to go to see a very familiar film star is one of the names that Norman has mentioned just now. Because there are no subtitles, so in this section, the lyrics of the song is somehow something like what makes a modern woman. Is the 1963 Shaw Brothers portrayal of the modern woman in 1963. This is Pirani. So I think on my as a role of the discussant, or as a role to feedback on Norman's presentation, I've decided not to act as purely as a commentator, but in a way I'd like to provide another side views of the 1950s and 1960s that is relevant with the history of the film history in Malaysia in the 1950s and 1960s. So and see if there's more things that could, more discussion can be generated before that. But before that part, I'd like to just give a few comments on on here, or maybe that's some of the keywords that we might, if we have time, we can discuss more about that. That is the chimera, the notion of time, and the notion of password, and the notion of authenticity. Because I think we have a very brief, very quick conversation yesterday night regarding what is the Malayness, and then after that, when I'm back to the room of the hostel, then we come upon the questions of what is Malaysianness, or what makes Chineseness, or questions like that. So the idea of chimera is, I think the chimera is a kind of, for me, we can see it as a kind of a very strange monster, but it's a very potential monster, that it offers an opportunity to re-examine and to reimagine the relation, not only in the region, I mean the Southeast Asia region, or the region of Asia, but a potential monster that problematizes history and open up a way to confront and to rethink the current or the contemporary issues that we are facing today. And I think from Norman's presentation, we can also see genres also works as the vision machines that triggers the idea of chimera, forming a chimera not only loosen geographical of boundaries, but also the relation of geography, time, and history. We can go back to that if later we have time. And also the notion of time, on why we're looking at particularly the era of 1950s and 1960s, when most of the time we are looking at history, or we thought history that is something that is past. But if we see history as the future of the past, I didn't say the quote. This is a quote by an Indian artist collective called the Rocks Media Collective. So they mentioned that history acts as the future of the past. So if we see history from this point of view, or from this perspective, suddenly history will then open up a new dimension of his futuristic element in it. And also the narrative of history is not a description of time, but rather in relation with the construction of space, that is the geography. And we often see history as something that as time passes, but we can take a look at that as well, of the word past. And in the films that we saw just now, and in the posters, the many posters that we saw in the PowerPoint just now, we see a lot of, we actually can encounter a lot of very interesting wordings. And we can see these words or these characters as passwords that will open up a door for us, or that will, not solving, but it will kind of open up another dimension that to us, because if we see passwords as a quasi-initiatory way of getting inside things, that we see past it. So it's actually a play of words, like pass and words. So it gives the word password a very strange energy in it. So I'm thinking, is it if every single keyword is a password in a way, but password in here is not in the sense of adding to its secrecy, is not something that is secretive, but a quasi-initiatory way of getting inside things. So we can also see genre or chora as a password as well. And so to continue this, I'd like to, like what I've mentioned in the beginning before, I'd like to respond in the other side of the stories of the 1950s and 1960s, particularly with the films made by the Shaw Brothers and also the Cathay-Keris, and some of the side history that I found it very fascinating. So this is just a title that I came up with. So it's the Colsey. So it's something like a response to a Cold War. And this is a poster, is in Chinese characters. So this is the poster of the third Southeast Asia Film Festival. The third Southeast Asia Film Festival was held in the year 1956 in Hong Kong. And for those who can recognize the Chinese characters, you can see here the third Southeast Asia Film Festival is still existing today, but it goes through a lot of transformation. Its name currently is called the Asia Pacific Film Festival, 亚太影展. So in the poster here, the now Asia Pacific Film Festival, you can't simply send your films to the festival, but you have to be the representative of a city. But in the early Southeast Asia Film Festival in 1956, you have to be the representative of a country in order for you to submit the films to the festival. So it's not unlike you have a film company and you make a films and then you just send the application. That's not possible during that time. So in this poster here, we can see which are the countries that are included in the 1956 Southeast Asia Film Festival. So we have Indonesia here, which is totally correct in the terms nowadays. Like it's obviously a Southeast Asia country, but then we have Hong Kong. Hong Kong during 1956 is British Hong Kong. It's not Hong Kong, China. And we have Singapore, which is quite right in today's terms. But we have Japan in the Southeast Asia Film Festival, and and that's probably about it in the poster here. So just like you to keep in mind of the names of those countries, why these countries and why not other countries? Why not the other Southeast Asia countries? Why there are no Vietnam in the list of the film festival here? So to put a little bit of background of the film festival, 1956 is the third one. So the first Southeast Asia Film Festival is 1954, and it was actually held in Tokyo. In 1953, Masaichi Nagata, he was a very famous film producer during that time, a Japanese film producer. So this Japanese film producer, in 1953, he traveled to, the term is not quite right here. He traveled to Taiwan, where in Taiwan in 1953 is actually seen from the perspective of the Americans and its allies, including Japan, as free China. So Taiwan is China during that time. And he traveled also to British Hong Kong. He traveled to Thailand, Malaya, Indonesia, Philippines. And then after the tour, he formed a Southeast Asian Film Producers Association, where the initial member includes Mr. Ran Shaw, who is the boss of the Shaw Brothers, the film company. And I think many of here, especially Malaysians or Hong Kong people, will know that he also established a very important Cantonese television station, TVB. He's also the owner, but he passed away, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. And so you can see here from the list of the tour of Mr. Masaichi Nagata that when you see the list of the places that he tours, they are obviously allies in some way, the British American allies, which if you get to know the Cold War, then you get to know which side they are on. And so in 1954, the first Southeast Asian Film Festival was held in Tokyo. So Japan was actually very comfortable with to be put inside the Southeast Asia regions in the early 1950s. But then in 1957, the name of the festival was changed to Asia Film Festival, just because Korea became one of the new members of the Film Producer Association. So they thought Korea is not Southeast Asia, so they need to change the name to Asia. And so in 1964, there's a typo here. In 1964, Taiwan became the organizer of the Asia Film Festival, and in this particular film festival, a very tragic thing happened, and it creates a disastrous consequences, especially to the Cathay organization and Cathay-Keris, just because of one person. Yeah, I'll try to speed up. So the one person is called Wanto. Wanto might seem not quite familiar, but he has a very famous father. So if you are living in KL, Kuala Lumpur, you must know a road called Jalan Lok Yew. Lok Yew Road. So Lok Yew is Lok Wanto's father. And Lok Wanto's was reported that he has a very keen interest in the film industry, and he has a very keen interest in photography as well. And so he actually published 2 books before, which is on the slides here. One is called Anko, and one is called A Company of Birds. And he's, from the books that he published, you can obviously see that he's a very nature person. But what is interesting here is there's another name that actually appeared in the books as well, that is called Malcolm MacDonald. Malcolm MacDonald is actually the highest commissioner that was sent by the British to be based in Southeast Asia during the 1950s and 1960s. So what relation do you have to have, or what kind of intimate relation that you need to have for a highest commissioner in Southeast Asia to co-write a book together, or even to write a forward for a photography book of natures that you publish. So there's a very interesting relation here. And this is Mr. Lok Wanto. So that's all his connection that that I summarized. So he's from the first poster that we saw in the Southeast Asia Film Festival, the third Southeast Asia Film Festival in Hong Kong. Lok Wanto was actually the chair of the festival during that year. And he's also the boss of the Cathay organization and Cathay-Keris, which Norman has mentioned just now. And also he has sidelines of a Mandarin film productions that is based in Hong Kong called MPNGI, which is a short form of motion, patent, and general investment company. So Lok Wanto was also said to be a great art collector, that he actually has collections, huge collections of Southeast Asian photographic work. And it was published, and some of his collections was kept in Australia, and I think the Malay Visuals Negara, which is the national art gallery in KL, Malaysia, they have published a book on the collections of his photographic works. And why did I mention Lok Wanto? Actually, in 1964, when the Asia Film Festival was held in Taiwan, after